Okay, good morning and welcome to everyone who is joining us. Thank you so much and welcome to the Governing Principles discussion. This is an opportunity where we engage former and current state leaders to hear their perspectives on how their states are navigating education in this unprecedented time. We're really excited about the two individuals that are joining us today and look forward to getting to them in just a moment. As we move forward in long term, we know that these conversations are going to be critical, so we also want to make sure you do engage in this conversation with us. Joining us today are Lieutenant Governor Mandela Barnes of Wisconsin and Lieutenant Governor Gregg of Iowa. So thank you again to both of them for joining us. Before we get started, a couple quick logistical notes. Please feel free to tweet throughout. We'd love to hear from you, both comments and questions. If you do, we appreciate you using the hashtag LTGovConvo, and we'll make sure that we engage with you and try to get your questions answered as well. For the sake of expediency, we're going to keep everyone on mute throughout this meeting, but we do want to hear from you. Both you have an opportunity to provide Q&A down at the bottom. So please chat in your questions. We know many of you already submitted some questions in advance of this meeting, so thank you for doing that. We'll get through as many as we can in this discussion. Next, I'd like to welcome the Hunt Institute's President and CEO, Dr. Javed Siddiqui, to open up the webinar. Over to you, Javed.
Good morning. Thank you, Patrick. And thanks to everybody for joining us today. Thank you to Lieutenant Governor Barnes, Lieutenant Governor Gregg for taking the time to share your insights. I know how busy you are during this time and appreciate you taking the opportunity to be with us, especially now as states are working hard to support schools and districts as they plan for what school may look like in the fall. The Institute has been fortunate enough to build relationships with a number of state leaders over the years through our Hunt Cain Leadership Fellows program. These two are two of our shining stars in that cohort in our program. So again, thanks to both of them. Through this work, though, we've had a chance to really grow an appreciation for the work Lieutenant Governors are doing in so many sectors: education, certainly, healthcare, justice, the economy, and what an impact they can have on the health, well-being, and education of children. I know both of these gentlemen today are committed to improving educational opportunity for students in their states, and excited for them to share their perspectives and to certainly push our thinking. To all of our guests, please don't hesitate to reach out to our team if you have any needs or questions. We at the Institute stand committed to support your educational policy needs. So with that, again, I want to thank you for all that you do, and I'll turn it back over to Patrick to get this conversation started.
Great. Thank you, Javed. And so just to make sure we get right into it, I'm going to open it up to hear from our two Lieutenant Governors. We're going to start with Lieutenant Governor Barnes. So again, thank you for joining us, Lieutenant Governor Barnes. I would love to hear a little bit more about your role in Wisconsin's response to COVID-19.
Absolutely, and thank you so much for having me. Thank you all for tuning in. Again, I'm Lieutenant Governor Mandela Barnes, and to get started with a little bit about how we've been battling COVID-19 in Wisconsin, it's like every other state. We've been dealing with the devastating impacts and the ways that it's shaken every facet of our lives. That ranges from education, healthcare, to our economy. But I'm proud to say that from the beginning, our administration has been working diligently to lead at every step of the way through the rapid changes of the pandemic. It remains a very fluid situation, and we have responded as such. Back in March, the governor declared the public health emergency, and he directed the Wisconsin Emergency Management team to activate the State Emergency Operations Center. And this basically served as a command center where all of our cabinet secretaries, this is where they reported to and where they oversaw the direct operations of our emergency response in Wisconsin. And around that same time in March, we made the difficult decision to close our K-12 schools to help limit the spread of the virus. And now Governor Evers was the state superintendent in Wisconsin before he was governor. So this wasn't a decision that he made easily. But an outbreak in a school was the last thing that we needed to see in our state. And a week later, we issued our Safer at Home order, and closing non-essential businesses and limiting people's interactions to those outside of their households as much as possible was the base of that Safer at Home order. And the incredible sacrifices that people all across Wisconsin made to stay home, we know that we saved at least hundreds of lives, 300 and perhaps as many as 1,400, depending on which models you look at. And according to those same models from our Department of Health Services, at the same time, we knew that staying at home and keeping people physically separated from each other was the best way for us to stop the virus. And it was working. we were flattening the curve like so many other places. But we knew that we needed a plan to gradually reopen our state in a way that didn't undo all the hard work that people had done in order for us to get to the point that we got into. But we began implementing our Badger Bounce Back Plan, which outlined the steps to decreasing COVID-19 cases and spread, and also increasing capacity in our healthcare system so that a phased reopening of businesses could be possible. And we ramped up our testing capacity to over 85,000 tests per week. We established and trained multiple National Guard teams to set up free testing sites throughout Wisconsin. And we distributed hundreds of thousands of items of PPE to community healthcare providers. But unfortunately, there was a lawsuit, and you may have heard about it. And that was filed by our legislature against us, and our Supreme Court ended up striking down our safer at home order, and it severely limited our ability to enact statewide orders and keep people safe. But this hasn't kept us from doing everything that we can throughout the state agencies to support the people of Wisconsin, to keep them as safe as possible. We've been able to make critical investments with the federal funds from the CARES Act in order to provide support where it is most needed. And apart from the major $1 billion investment that we made in expanding testing and contact tracing and supporting local health department, we've invested $75 million in grants to our small businesses who continue to struggle in this pandemic, $25 million in rental assistance to people who are dealing with the economic insecurity that comes along with a pandemic, people who are facing foreclosure, people who are facing eviction. We also provided $50 million in direct relief to our farmers, $15 million to combat food insecurity, $100 million for nursing homes and long-term care facilities, and $200 million for local government to continue operations seamlessly. And $80 million also for our K-12 schools and colleges and universities. And my office in particular has worked to play a role in our administration's outreach to faith communities in Wisconsin. We set up regular calls with faith leaders across the state to keep them up to date on what we were up to and how to best keep their congregants safe, and also how they can help play a role in stopping the spread. My office has also been instrumental in working with the 11 federally recognized tribal nations in Wisconsin, making sure that we have open lines of communication with our tribal leaders, working to secure additional CARES Act funds to support tribal residents and ensuring that their sovereignty is honored. And we've also worked to procure thousands of masks, tens of thousands of masks, in fact, to distribute to people in need, from communities in Milwaukee to even some of those who've been participating in protests, because we know that, we discourage mass gatherings, but sometimes the moment calls for it, but we want people to do it safely. And over the last several weeks, we followed national trends, unfortunately. We've seen a surge in COVID-19 cases, but our public health officials have confirmed that this surge isn't necessarily a result of people gathering in protest. They're actually the result of people who have been ceasing to follow public health guidelines by going to restaurants and bars, going to parties at each other's homes and not social distancing, or wearing masks and keeping that physical distances. And I understand what we've been through for 4 months of this, and none of it is easy. And we're here to talk about schools and equity. And at a certain point, we have to put our kids first and prioritize getting this virus under control over our own desire to socialize so that this next generation has an opportunity. And I'm very concerned about the surge in cases, and the administration is going to continue to encourage people to stay home as much as they possibly can, to wear masks anytime they leave the house, and to limit their interactions with others so that we can finally move past this crisis. And I got a little bit wordy, but there's just so much going on, and I am ready to pass the mic over to my good friend, Lieutenant Governor Adam Gregg.
Thank you, Governor Barnes, and certainly understand there is a lot to cover. I asked you a very big question, so thanks for summarizing that for us. Governor Gregg, would love to hear about your role in Iowa and what I know there are a lot of similar themes that we just heard, but would love to hear a little bit more about how you all are approaching it right now.
Absolutely. Well, thank you, Patrick, for hosting this. Thanks to the Hunt Institute and Javaid. Really appreciate the kinds of conversations that the Hunt Institute helps sponsor. I am a proud alum of the Hunt Kane Fellowship, and I really appreciated that opportunity to learn more about education policy and to grow as a leader, and appreciate the continued opportunity to participate in the programming with the Hunt Institute. I also should note that my governor, Kim Reynolds, is also a Hunt Kane alum, and I believe she was in the very first cohort of that fellowship. And so we're both very proud and honored to have been a part of it. To Lieutenant Governor Barnes, great to see you again. We were talking before we went live. I think it's been a year since we've actually been together in person, which is too long for neighbors. So we can't let that happen again. And hopefully the pandemic will allow for us to get together in person again sometime soon. But thank you for being a part of this and for your leadership during this pandemic. And thanks to the attendees for tuning in. Governor Reynolds and really all leaders across the country have had to balance so many different issues during this pandemic. And I think about our experience here in Iowa and all of the challenges that the governor was balancing that all hit all at once. Challenges from a public health perspective, from an economic perspective, from an education perspective. There are so many aspects to this. But one of the things that Governor Reynolds prioritized is food insecurity. And she did that by creating a Feeding Iowans task force and tasking me to lead that as her lieutenant governor. And so I'll use my time here just to talk a little bit about what that was and what that looked like here in Iowa. And I do hope to have the opportunity here shortly to dive deeper into the education connection on food insecurity because it's really significant. But generally speaking, we saw the same thing in Iowa that many other states saw as it relates to food insecurity. You saw an unprecedented spike in unemployment as a result of the economic impacts of the pandemic and the closures that occurred or slowdowns in the economy, et cetera. And what that did was that caused many Iowans and many Americans to face food insecurity for the very first time. And that created new challenges for the food banks and for food pantries and others operating in that environment. And we were very proud to see Iowans stepping up to meet those in need. But the role of the Feeding Iowans Task Force was to help solve some of those challenges that inevitably come up when you're facing that type of situation. A couple of those that I'll highlight. From a volunteer workforce perspective, our food banks and food pantries, just like many nonprofits, tend to rely on retirees, older individuals to serve in those roles. Well, of course, this pandemic was particularly brutal for older Iowans. And so right when there's this increased demand, their volunteer workforce kind of goes away. And they also had to shift their models. Normally at many pantries, there'd be a consumer choice model where folks would be able to walk through and choose the food that they want to include. Well, they couldn't do that during the pandemic. So they shifted to pantry boxes, which takes much more labor up front. So right when you have an increased demand and a change in model that requires more labor was right the moment when that volunteer base had to go away. And so the governor deployed the National Guard to assist with the food banks and on other matters as well. We redeployed AmeriCorps workers from all across our state who maybe had their programs canceled or significantly changed and put them towards food insecurity, working at the food banks in a variety of capacities. And there also is a connection to the FFA that I hope to be able to highlight that was really significant as well. Another thing I'd highlight real quick is the issue of food acquisition. Food banks had troubles acquiring food, right? Because of this sharply increased demand, and it was true all across the country, supply chains were impacted. And they were also impacted because there were many meatpacking plants that had outbreaks that required slowdowns or even shutdowns, and that impacted the food supply. So we got creative here in Iowa, and we're very fortunate and blessed to have 1/3 of the nation's pork production in the state of Iowa. We have 1/4 of the processing capabilities here in Iowa. And so we were able to leverage that fact to help those who are food insecure. And because of some of those, I'll spare you all the details, but because of some of the slowdowns, there were significant impacts on the pork industry to the point where there was going to be hogs that were going to have to be euthanized. And so we created a program called Pass the Pork, where farmers could donate pigs that otherwise likely would have gone to waste. And we were able to get those processed into ground pork and donated to the food banks. We've completed the first phase of that. There was over 50,000 pounds of ground pork that was donated through this program. That's 200,000 servings. Protein like that is hard to come by in food insecurity, in the food insecurity world. And so it was really meaningful. And we've gone ahead and we've expanded that into beef as well. We call that program Beef Up Iowa. And we've also done this other creative things to create our own, I think of this as creating our own mini supply chains in Iowa. So beyond the Pass the Pork and Beef Up Iowa, we also have been conducting bulk purchases of pasta and rice and other shelf-stable materials that food banks report they're struggling to acquire. And we're buying those by the truckload, and we've dedicated AmeriCorps workers to repackage those into consumer-sized packaging for distribution through the food bank system. And I guess the last thing I'd mention is I think a key role for the Feeding Iowans Task Force and in my aspect of this response is to try to raise awareness of the resources that are available as Iowans are dealing with food insecurity for themselves and their children. Again, many folks who have never experienced this before, never navigated the system, maybe had never needed to access this before. And we wanted to make sure that they understood where the gateways were and how to access that when they need it. And again, I haven't even touched on the education aspect of this, which is really significant and an important conversation as we look toward reopening in the fall as well.
Thank you so much, Governor Gregg, and we will come back to that in just a moment. Governor Barnes, we just heard a lot about creativity and rethinking. We know that right now education, the landscape has been fundamentally changed, and that also presents an opportunity to reevaluate the way our system's set up and to enact changes to improve equity within the system. What improvements would you like to see coming out of the crisis?
Yeah, before I get to that question too, I'll say that like a lot of the answers that we're looking for are right in front of our faces. Lieutenant Governor Gregg talked about, food insecurity, and it's, a wild thought to imagine the level of food insecurity given the amount of food that each of our states produce. And, to think that there are people who still don't know where their next meal is going to come from. At the same time, there are producers that don't know what they're going to do with all the surplus food that they have that could potentially prepare meals. So I just wanted to put that out there. But I've been saying for some time now that going back to normal isn't really an option because normal didn't work for enough people. Instead, we have to build a better world. And that includes that is especially true, I should say, within our education system. And while we're all grappling with whether or not schools should reopen or not this fall, COVID-19 shouldn't be the only thing that we're fearful of. We should also be concerned about returning to a system that continues to fail so many over and over and over again. In my state, the gap between those who have opportunity within our school system and those who don't is stark. We are home to the nation's widest opportunity gap for Black and white children. And while 94% of white students graduate from high school in Wisconsin, only 69% of Black students do. And in addition to that troubling statistic, our Latinx and Indigenous students also don't hit the marks that our white students do. And we see these disparities at an early age. And if you look at fourth grade reading proficiencies here in my state, you'll see that white students are far more likely to be proficient than their Black, Indigenous, and Latinx classmates. And there are also other opportunity gaps. We see students with disabilities and how their performance can be a challenge. And these gaps don't come as a surprise in my state, and where we witnessed here a wave of policies in the past several years that defunded our state's public schools. Even to this day, we see members of the legislature who still refuse to provide the support that our public schools need. And these are policies that have also hurt teachers, individuals who devoted their careers to caring for and educating our state's future leaders. And instead of returning to normal, like I said before, I just want to issue a challenge to leaders in the state, whether it's school board members, whether it's legislators, whoever, anybody involved in the process, anybody in the education universe, to harness this moment that we have, this moment of despair that we all seem to be in, and truly analyze where we are and come up with solutions to build a system that truly meets the needs of every child. There are so many different points that we need to be sure to address that our students, or different marks that our students are missing. We can talk about food insecurity, which is a huge problem, and students that show up to school hungry don't learn at the same level, and all of our opportunity gaps, and I call them opportunity gaps, instead of achievement or education gaps is because there's so many other factors that are tied into a student's success. And we have to be able to meet those critical needs where they exist so that we can get students on level playing field. Because if we don't have students on level playing field, we can't truly judge their performance or accurately grade their output.
Thank you, Governor Barnes. That's a really helpful overview, and I know we're going to be able to get into a little more detail on some of those specifics as we continue the conversation. Governor Gregg, we'd love to come back to you and just thinking a little more specifically about that interaction between education and food insecurity, and just thinking about how we ensure that students have the resources they need for their health and to be able to learn. I'd love to just share a little bit more about how you all are thinking about that in Iowa.
Well, absolutely. And I mentioned earlier that I had the opportunity to lead the Feeding Iowans Task Force, and the governor appointed a number of key members to that. And one of the really important members of that was a representative from the Department of Education, a woman by the name of Kayla Shipley here in Iowa, who manages the food-related programs for the state. And the education aspect of this was such an important part of the food insecurity puzzle in handling this during the crisis. And so just a couple things I'd like to highlight as it relates to that. One of the things that was really key this spring into the summer was the use of the summer food service program. And we were able to expand the timing and location of that, do some very helpful waivers that we received from the federal government. We also received significant funding from the CARES Act to support these efforts. I believe it was over $100 million that came to Iowa as a result of that. And what we saw was we saw schools stand up feeding programs, sometimes in places where they had never had them before, and certainly at times of the year when they would not normally have those types of things. And it allowed school districts to be able to think creatively to meet the needs in their areas. You saw folks transition to grab and go meals, and there was a lot of flexibility that was provided in terms of who can pick those up and when, and all these things that are normally pretty onerous and detailed regulations. We were able to receive some flexibility so that we could meet that need all across our state. One of the other things that I'd highlight here in Iowa is the PEBT program, the pandemic EBT program. We're using funds that would have been expended on the free and reduced lunch children, and we're distributing those unused funds to those students. So in Iowa, that's going to be $76.2 million that are going out this month. Means that families will be receiving about $308 on their EBT card if they already have one, or they'll be issued a new PEBT card. And I think that's a creative way to get some additional help to those families that are in need. And it's targeted to the right families using funds that would have otherwise gone unspent. And really proud of that fact here in Iowa. I mentioned earlier in my intro that there was a connection here with the FFA, and we worked really hard to get students engaged in the response. Again, it goes back to that issue of so many volunteers in this arena tend to be considered elderly, and so how could we get younger people more engaged? And so we reached out to the FFA, who, as folks interested in agriculture and farming, already have a clear connection to the issue of food insecurity and food supply in our country, and a younger demographic in the schools who could help us meet this challenge. And so we had FFA students that were staffing mobile rural pantry distributions right alongside the National Guard. Really pretty inspiring to see that. And we've also worked to create what's called the gleaning program, working with our specialty crop producers. Think about the farmers who would typically sell at a farmer's market and those types of venues, as opposed to mass production of corn, soybeans, livestock, etc. Well, there's a lot of that food that either will go unharvested or go unsold at the farmer's market. And so we've created a partnership with the FFA to glean those unharvested or unsold items and be able to dedicate them to food banks and food pantries so that we can get more fresh fruits and vegetables. That takes a lot of work and a lot of coordination, but it's I think a really, again, creative way of creating our own little supply chains as it relates to food insecurity. Looking ahead to the fall, there's a lot of thought that's going into school food programs and preparing for what's likely to be a very dynamic environment. I mentioned earlier, the summer food service program was the mechanism that was used here in the spring and summer. And that's got some different eligibility requirements and different costs associated with it. So for example, the summer food service program, any child under 18 in that area is eligible for that, and it's free. But as we transition into coming back into the school year and you move away from the summer food service program and move into the national school lunch program and school breakfast programs, those eligibility standards are a little bit different. Instead of all children that are under 18, it's only the enrolled students. Instead of it being free for everybody, there's a sliding scale of free, reduced, or paid meals. And so what that creates for schools is just a more complex environment on top of decisions that they have to make regarding meal service, whether it's going to be in a classroom or in a congregated environment, in the lunchroom, or whatever the case may be. And so there's a lot of thought that's going into that and a lot of preparation, but also some hope that there'll be maybe some federal waivers again that will allow for some flexibility to deal with the fact that it's going to be a dynamic and changing environment. And there might be different environments in different school districts even.
Thank you so much. I've heard both of you reference CARES Act and thinking about federal funding. And we had a question that was asked when somebody registered about how you're thinking about anticipated potential state budget cuts coming down the pipeline and what that means for funding for education, both for K-12 and for early childhood and early care. And then also just what do you think the appropriate role is for the federal government here, and what kind of support you need from a financial perspective? I'd love to hear from both of you, but I'll turn it to you first, Governor Barnes.
Yeah, thank you for that. And there were a couple points too that I was going to hit on earlier. I can come back to those. But when we think about consequences financially of COVID-19 and school funding, our support for schools started in our state budget, where we provided long-needed increases in funding. We also recently allocated $46.6 million of CARES Act funding to our K-12 schools. And we're going to continue to work with schools and implore our legislature to fund them at an adequate level so they're able to make up their losses and also adjust to like I said, the changing set of circumstances. What we're seeing is a huge digital divide, and it exists in urban communities, low-income communities, as well as our rural communities. And as long as that need exists, as long as that divide exists, as long as that inequality of access exists, we're going to exacerbate some long-standing issues that we have. And one of the questions too, I had a conversation with a school board member, and it was tough. This person is a really close friend of mine, so we were able to kind of have a conversation at that level. And he, said, quite frankly, right now our choice is which inequality do we exacerbate? And when the question is, do you open schools in the fall? And this isn't exactly the question, but it's in the area. So I want to touch on it while we have the opportunity to. But there are school board members who meet virtually to decide if schools should open in person in the fall. And well, if it's not safe for 7 school board members to meet in person, I kind of think you may have the answer to the question there. However, if schools aren't open in person, where, what was mentioned earlier about students who qualify for free and reduced lunch, like that is an amazing idea with the PEBT. But, that's not the reality here in Wisconsin. So a lot of students who depend on schools for meals, and unfortunately, a lot of children who depend on schools for some sort of shelter during the day. And, if that digital divide still exists, because, we still haven't solved that problem across the country, you're going to see those students continue to fall behind. You're going to see them still faced with challenges. But if you do open schools, then you run into another problem. Do you exacerbate the health crisis, where you could potentially see a large spread? It will be incredibly difficult, if not impossible, to keep high school students, especially elementary school students, from physical distancing. And the problem there is, you can look at whatever data you want, and you may see where, children don't necessarily experience the worst symptoms of COVID-19, but the reality is a lot of our children in a lot of these communities live with their grandparents or live in multi-generational households or very large households. And the children could potentially bring the virus back to vulnerable populations, and we will see increased rate of severe transmission and even death. But again, that's what's important for us to, for our legislature to come in and answer some of these problems, not just the funding question. The funding question is the question that's going to be there until the end of time. What we need is the strategy conversation. We need the process conversation. And looking at the entire state budget, just yesterday, the administration announced that we're going to be making $250 million in cuts for the fiscal year that just started, so we can put ourselves in a stronger position to deal with the revenue shortages that we have. We're gonna have to make a lot of tough decisions, but we're gonna prioritize providing high quality services to the people of our state and maintain a focus on equity and sustainability as we move on to the next budget. And we need desperately the federal government to respond appropriately where the need exists. And it's very stressful, when the question is, it could not be more apparent, when the question cannot be more explicit, yet we're not getting the answers from the federal government. The answer is investment in broadband, so that the communities that don't have it do have that access, so that our children can learn however school resumes in the fall, because it will resume one way or the other. But we have to make sure that it is an equitable return to education. And schools and communities across the country have to come together also to provide, again, those nutritional needs for those students. And our Department of Public Instruction has worked with school districts across the state to make sure that our children and families have the food that they need. And we've also seen communities throughout the state work with local farms to provide that fresh food to people who need it. And we are working to connect those dots as best as we can.
And I can jump in on the budget impact side here in Iowa. We're very proud of the fact that we came into the pandemic in about as strong a budget position as we possibly could have been. We had a balanced budget. Our cash reserves were full, equaling 10% of our general fund budget. We had a surplus on top of that of about $300 million at the close of the previous fiscal year. And so it's hard to imagine coming into the pandemic in a stronger position than that. And I guess I'd be remiss if I didn't say, we all take criticism for the decisions that we make. And I think sometimes being conservative in budgeting is one of those areas where we take some heat. But I think the wisdom of that has proven out here, because it has meant that we've had less of a budget economic impact, because we had built in some cushion as we were projecting what next year's budget was going to be. Even with a significant reduction in revenue, we were able to have some cushion there, so that we didn't have to cut to the bone when the unexpected occurs. And it doesn't get any more unexpected than a unprecedented international pandemic like we've faced. So as we came into this legislative session, projecting out for the next budget year, we had anticipated some pretty significant revenue growth, but with the reduction in those projections, that it just meant that we reverted to more of a flat budget overall, and that there weren't as big of increases across the board, and we weren't able to make certainly some of the investments that we had wanted to back in January when we came in. From an education perspective, proud of the fact that we were able to maintain what our promise was on education funding. In Iowa, they act on education funding earlier on in session before the rest of the budget is created. And the legislature had settled on about $100 million increase for education. And so even with the reduced projections, we were able to maintain that promise for school districts going forward. And I think that's really important. Certainly CARES Act dollars have assisted in that in a variety of ways, the financial impacts, but it goes back to making some of the tough decisions when times were good to prepare for situations that are completely unexpected like this. And I think we're in a much stronger position because of it.
Right. Thank you both. So it's a helpful way to frame the discussion. And we did have a question come in that was building on something we heard earlier around broadband, and knowing that investing in broadband is critical, and especially in the long term, but we know that we have some real short-term needs as well. So the question was, what is it that we can do in the fall? And I think I would actually have a two-part question here to pull in another question that we had received about how to ensure and help districts be nimble as needed in the fall as data changes and we realize we may need to shift plans. But so what are some of the lessons we've learned to help in the fall as students have to learn from distance, or if they're doing a hybrid approach, and how can we make sure that students have equitable access to internet and technology? And how do we help districts be nimble and be responsive as needed based on the changing circumstances? Governor Barnes, would you like to start?
Yep. So first, you got to understand that each school district across our state is going to be a little bit different. There are population differences, there are demographic differences, there are distance differences that make the way that, or their decision to open or reopen, that much easier, that much more difficult. But at this point, we think local school districts are in the best position to make those tough decisions. So our administration's goal is to provide them with the guidance, but also provide them with the resources. We started to ship over 2 million cloth face masks and more than 4,200 infrared thermometers to K-12 public, charter, and private schools throughout our state. And our Department of Public Instruction has released Education Forward, which is a guidance document meant to provide information for educators and school officials as they plan for a safe and equitable return to school, whatever that may look like, wherever that happens. And this guidance document presents several options for how school districts can move forward safely, whether they choose to do so full-time in person or a hybrid model where certain students attend in person on certain days or all virtual learning. And the document also includes information on infection control and mitigation. It lays out some sample learning scenarios and specific considerations for special education students, English language learners, school libraries, school safety and mental health professionals, and our out of school time programs. And there's a lot to balance in these decisions, and equity for some of our most marginalized students, socialization for our youngest students, and the safety of our students, families, educators, and other staff. And I just want to say too is, there's not a good option on the table. There's not a comfortable option. There's not a thing where we look and say, oh, that's the one that's going to solve all of our problems, or that's going to be the thing. But I think our goal is the goal of most, or should be every state, is to do the least amount of harm in this situation. We are severely on the defensive against COVID-19. The pandemic has the upper hand. I think we should be very clear about that right now. So being backed into a corner, there are tough decisions that have to be made. And I hate that we're in this position. I wish that the federal response would have been much different. We could have been in the place where other countries across the world are, where they are resuming to a much more normal life. But one thing is true, though, our school districts will be in a much better position the more that we do, especially as adults, to get the virus under control. And it's not an insurmountable task in my state. In early to mid-June, things were moving in a positive direction, and our daily new cases were trending downward. But like I said before, over the last several weeks, we followed the national trends. And on July 9th, the New York Times reported that since Safer at Home was struck down, our 7-day average of new cases had increased by 111%. And even since July 9th, we've broken our own record for highest daily increase in cases 6 times. And this goes specifically to the conversation about equity, because we have to look at where the impact is being most felt with COVID-19, and it is in lower income communities, communities of color who are dealing with this in some of the most tragic ways. And I can even go back to the broadband conversation, because Wisconsin ranks, I want to say, 30th in broadband access, which is a disaster for students who are already so far behind socially, and for them to be expected to learn at the same rate, the same ways that their more affluent counterparts are, is completely unrealistic. So we have to take the virus more seriously, but we also have to take inequality more serious, so that we are able to address this in the most appropriate and equitable way.
And I can build off the, the connectivity discussion. Broadband connectivity has been a priority of this administration from day one. One of the hats that I wear, beyond, I mentioned the Feeding Iowans Task Force, but governor's had me working on, it's called the Empower Rural Iowa Initiative, where we're looking at rural economic prosperity, et cetera. But a key aspect of that, of course, is connectivity. So we've been talking about this for quite some time, but I think this pandemic really shined a spotlight on how important it is from so many perspectives, whether it's the business perspective and how so many companies had to go to mass teleworking situations on a very short timeline. That includes state government, quite frankly. You think about it from a telehealth perspective, where usage of telehealth has really increased as a way to protect our healthcare workers and make sure that folks who don't need to be seen in person can get the care that they need. So we've been relying on that. And of course, education is a clear example of that, with so many schools having to go to distance learning on a really short timeline. And so one of the things that we're using this as an opportunity to do is really make significant investments into some long-term solutions for broadband connectivity. Let me just give you a little bit of context here. So through the Empower Rural Iowa Initiative, we've put together legislative packages and budget packages supporting broadband expansion in rural parts of our state. In the past 2 years, we were able to get $5 million each year appropriated from the legislature. Well, the governor's decided to dedicate a significant amount of the federal CARES Act dollars into broadband expansion in our state. And our state CIO office, which manages the grant, put out notice of funding availability, I believe it was yesterday or the day before, and we're doing $50 million into broadband connectivity. So, fight tooth and nail through a budget process to get $5 million of state money, but the CARES Act dollars come in and we're able to do 10 times that. And that's going to have a lasting impact. It doesn't have an impact tomorrow, unfortunately, because those projects, they do take some time to get done. But because of the strings that are attached to the CARES Act dollars, that money does have to be distributed, I believe, by December 30th of this year. So it will have a very rapid impact. And I guess the other thing I'd mention is it goes beyond just connectivity. It's also helping to make sure that our educators have the resources that they need to be able to teach the kids in this new online environment, which no one has really had to navigate until this spring, at least to this extent. And so one of the things that our Department of Education has been doing is creating professional development opportunities for teachers and help equip them with best practices and strategies to be able to teach in these environments. We created what's called Iowa e-Learning Central using $6.8 million of the ESSER dollars within the CARES Act to provide those online resources for teachers so that they're prepared for any scenario.
Thank you so much. And I know we are coming up on time. I did want to give each of you just one more minute if you would like to provide some quick closing remarks before we do end. And Governor Barnes, I'll start with you.
Yeah, thanks a lot, first of all, for having me. It's a really important conversation that can't be had enough. Just given the seemingly uncontrollable situation that we're in, but there are some things that we can control, and that is working diligently and very intentionally to close some of those access gaps wherever they exist. And that's the role of government, in my opinion. That's why I ran for office in the first place, having been in situations myself, having attended a school with a very challenged population. I had, a lot of friends who had certain insecurities, and they're the things I didn't necessarily think about then or realize were insecurities that they had. It wasn't until I got older and I began to reflect on my own time throughout school where I really realized what that situation was that they were dealing with. And I think about, myself, and, I don't come from wealth, I don't come from privilege, but relatively speaking, I was in a far more comfortable situation than many of the people that I was around. And I think that was a huge difference maker for me, because a lot of the people I grew up with, a lot of people I went to school with, could have gone on and do some really, really incredible things. But unfortunately, too many were limited in the access to resources that they had. And for us to ensure that we have a society, be it in my state and obviously selfishly, in relentless pursuit of Wisconsin's achievement, I think that across the country, we have to answer that call and think about how many bright young minds, how many future scientists, doctors, lawyers, teachers, governors, political leaders that we could have, produced, but didn't, because we didn't answer the other call. And so when we have conversations about education, I think that we have to be sure to talk about the entire universe, everything that impacts education as well, because that is where we find the actual solutions. When people show up equally resourced, equally equipped to take on the task of learning.
Thank you so much, Governor Barnes, and thank you for joining us today. We very much appreciate it.
Thank you, and I'm
Governor
sorry.
Gregg?
Hop off now. I'm really interested in your closing remarks, Governor Gregg. I have to run though.
I understand. Well, I think that fits really well with, kind of my final thoughts. First of all, thank you to the Hunt Institute. Thank you to Patrick for hosting us. Obviously, we're navigating an incredibly dynamic environment and dealing with situations that we've never had to deal with before. I think it's so important that we continue to keep our focus on the children and on their education, and how important this is to their development. And that's true on so many fronts. You think about it, obviously from their academic development standpoint. I've talked a lot about food insecurity. You think about it from that physical development standpoint and getting the food that they need and the nourishment that they need. But also think about it from the perspective of their social development. Kids need that opportunity to socialize with their peers, to develop those social emotional skills so that they can be a highly functioning adult down the road. Folks need that opportunity for physical activity that comes in a school environment. Access to some of the resources that they simply can't get in the same way at home, like mental health resources and others. And obviously the interaction with their teachers, et cetera. And so I think it's really important that we keep that as the primary focus, because we've got an obligation to these kids, to this generation that's going through the education system right now, that we're able to meet their needs, even in this incredibly dynamic and complex and changing environment. And then the other thought I would have here is just, last week, Governor Reynolds and I had a press conference where we talked about what does school reopening look like, et cetera. And we were at Van Meter Schools, and one of the participants in the press conference was the Van Meter superintendent. There were a lot of things that stuck with me from his remarks, but one of the things that he said, and I think it's true of all of us beyond even the education context, and he said, let's give each other grace. Let's give each other grace throughout this process. You've got, at the state level, certainly the governor and myself and cabinet members and other leaders who are navigating a challenging environment. You've got school board members who probably never thought they'd be dealing with some of these issues. You've certainly got school administrators who are in that spot as well. You've got teachers who are dealing with a new environment. I think we would all do well to give each other grace and know that we're all focused on trying to do the best thing possible for our kids, while we're also trying to make sure it's the safest environment possible as well. So with that, thanks again to the Hunt Institute. Thank you, Patrick, for this conversation. Thanks to Lieutenant Governor Barnes, even though he can no longer hear me. I certainly appreciate his friendship and his comments here today.
Great. Thank you so much, Governor Gregg, and really appreciate you joining us today. And that is a great way to close this out. So thank you for those remarks as well. We have a few more opportunities coming up for everybody as it relates to webinars. And I do also want to apologize. I know we didn't get to every question, but we're going to try and get to some of those via Twitter. So keep an eye on hashtag #LTGovConvo, and we will try to make sure that we get some more answers to your questions shared there. This webinar it has been recorded. We'll be uploading that to our website along with a recap, so that if you have questions, want to review anything that you may have heard here, look out for that. Please visit our upcoming webinars page, huntinstitute.org/upcoming-webinars, where we have a host of upcoming webinars for you to join us with. One in particular coming up next Tuesday, It starts off our race and education series, where we'll be diving into some of the challenging questions around how to improve equity across race and ethnicity. We also have some pretty exciting rural post-secondary conversations coming up, specifically around Illinois, but with lessons certainly for folks from all states, coming up on July 27th and August 6th, both at 11:30 a.m. Eastern. So please join us for those as well. Finally, check out our Hunt Institute COVID-19 landing page, where we have a host of resources around COVID-19. We'd love to get any feedback, or if you have any additional questions, to try to answer them for you. So again, thank you so much to both of our Lieutenant Governors. Governor Gregg, thank you again. It was a pleasure to have you.
Thank you.